It's an honour being asked to give the first presentation at this international workshop, and also to have been associated with the Centre for Sustainable Road Freight over the past decade. My presentation is in keeping with the net zero theme of this first session. According to the latest UN data, there are 8,307 companies and 52 countries and regions that are now committed to achieving net zero carbon emissions by 2050 at the latest. Seldom can two words have generated so many promises and yet have had their meaning so misinterpreted, because people often overlook the fact that there's an important sequestration side to net zero. There's a growing realization that we're going to overshoot the carbon budgets for 1.5 degree temperature rise, and we'll have to, as the century progresses, recapture vast amounts of greenhouse gas already in the atmosphere. Here is a succinct definition of net zero from Dieter Helm's book on the subject, where he says that net zero means that natural and industrial sequestration must be equal to or greater than the remaining carbon emissions. And I think when considering net zero, it's important to draw two distinctions. One is between carbon sources and carbon sinks, because all businesses are sources of CO2, but very few of them have the ability to absorb CO2. There are some examples, for example, in the chemical industry. But for most business entities, they will have to rely on others to perform that sequestration process if they want to achieve net zero. So the question arises, are there sequestration opportunities within the road freight sector? And I would venture to say that there are two. First of all, you can engage in what we call mobile carbon capture and storage, where you put equipment on board a truck to capture CO2 emissions from the exhaust, and I'll say more about that shortly. The second is a bit more hypothetical, because if we recognize that road freight is going to have a pivotal role to play in industrial scale carbon sequestration in the future, moving biomass, moving the solvents and sorbents we will need to filter the CO2, and moving the liquidized CO2, you could say that perhaps the road freight sector will deserve some carbon credits for providing that vital service. The second distinction is between stocks and flows. Obviously, we need to minimize the net flow of CO2 emissions into the atmosphere on an ongoing basis. But once we've exceeded our carbon budgets, then we will have to absorb much of the CO2 that's already in the atmosphere, because remember, it's the accumulated CO2 in the atmosphere which is driving climate change. And we will ultimately have to do this on a gargantuan scale. If one looks at the latest IPCC assessment report, suggesting that between 2020 and 2100, we may have to remove as much as 360 billion tons of CO2 from the atmosphere using one of these two processes, BECCS, bioenergy carbon capture and storage, or direct air capture carbon and storage. And to put that figure into perspective, that's 10 times as much CO2 as the world emitted in 2019. And also, if you consider what our current capability is using direct air capture, using mechanical and chemical means to get CO2 out of the atmosphere, in 2021, only 10,000 tons were captured. Only 19 plants in the world were capable of doing that. The more aggressively we drive down emissions today using mitigation measures, the less dependent we will be in the future on sequestration. So there's no question that mitigation must be our main priority. So the question is, to what extent are we in the right trajectories really to meet our carbon reduction targets, in this case for the transport sector as a whole. This uses a European Environment Agency data, and you can see from that graph that we're nowhere near being on track to reach the EU's Fit for 55 target for transport, 55% reduction in emissions relative to 1990, or the 2050 target, a 90% reduction against 1990. The EEA has projected forward the trend looking at the existing policy measures currently in place, and also a much more radical set of measures, additional measures. And if you look at the gap then that opens up between those trends and what we would have to do to meet those targets, even just up to 2030, the if the existing measures trend is followed, then the accumulated overshoot in emissions over that 9-year period would be something like 2.4 billion tons of CO2, which is an awful lot of CO2 that's going to have to be removed from the atmosphere at some later stage. This graph, also from the EEA, shows that since 1990, the trend in emissions from heavy-duty vehicles has very closely paralleled that of transport as a whole, as you can see. Unfortunately, the EEA lumps buses in with trucks in their definition of heavy-duty vehicles, but as you can see from the pie chart at the bottom, trucks represent almost 90% of those emissions, and it was only really in 2020 during the pandemic that we saw a significant dip in those emissions, but the road freight emissions then rebounded fairly rapidly after the pandemic. And if we rebase that data for 2020 rather than 1990, and we look at the components in that overall trend in trucking emissions over that time period, you can see there are 4 factors that have strongly influenced the trend in emissions from heavy-duty vehicles in Europe. Above the axis are the 2 drivers of that growth in emissions. First of all, just the growth in demand for road freight over that period, supplemented by some modal shift, mainly from rail. And then below the axis, those factors which have tried to depress, if you like, the amount of CO2 from trucking, improvements in the energy efficiency of these vehicles, which has been quite impressive, again combined with the use of biofuels, the blending particularly of biodiesel with diesel, and the net effect of all of that is represented by the white dots in that graph, and you can see that in only 3 years of the 19 represented there did we see a reduction in net emissions from trucking over that period. One could also quibble about the net contribution of the use of biofuels. The statistics there relate to tank-to-wheel emissions. If you were to do a well-to-wheel emission assessment of the use of biofuels, then I suspect the reduction in greenhouse gases would be significantly less. We can drill down even further using emissions modelling work done by the International Transport Forum, the ITF, for the European Commission, which distinguishes urban from non-urban freight and passenger movements. That analysis also distinguishes what they call current ambition, relating to existing policy measures, represented rather harshly by a snail, from high ambition, much more radical set of policy initiatives. But even that high ambition policy scenario falls well short of meeting the 2030 and 2050 carbon reduction targets that the European Commission has set. But one other thing that emerges from that graph is to show that the main challenge on the freight side in reducing emissions lies more in non-urban rather than in urban movements. It's the longer haul movements of freight which are going to be harder to decarbonise according to this analysis than our urban movements. So what are the road freight decarbonisation levers that we should be pulling much more aggressively to get emissions onto the right downward track? Well, there are the 5 that I and others have written about, starting with reducing the total demand for road freight. Worth noting that the European Academies of Science Advisory Council, in a report on decarbonising European transport back in 2019, said that we might have to think about actually controlling that demand, reverses a policy way back in 2011 that we shouldn't be curbing mobility as a decarbonisation option. But given that we're in a climate emergency, we have to consider doing more draconian things. Thankfully, there are a number of developments which I think would make that policy a bit more economically, socially and politically palatable. There are other freight reducing trends like circularity, more localization of production, digitalization, perhaps the development of 3D printing would help us to curb future demand for road freight. There's the old policy staple, moving more freight to lower carbon transport modes, away from road towards rail and inland waterways. And the EU has this ambition to see a 50% increase in rail freight ton kilometres by 2030 and a doubling by 2050. That is actually not a modal shift target, it's a rail specific target. And if one looks at the recent past, between 2010 and 2020, there was actually an increase in the road sector's share of the freight market in Europe, despite a whole suite of expensive policy measures to get more freight onto rail. So the best that one can say is that that's perhaps reduced the erosion of freight from rail to road rather than fundamentally changing the modal shift. And one must also note that about a fifth of the rail freight tonnage in 2020 was fossil fuel. So as we decarbonise the European economy, that's going to deprive the railways of what has been one of their core traffics. Third option, again, I'm sure you're all well familiar with it, simply filling vehicle capacity. The beauty of doing that is it's got relatively low or even negative carbon mitigation costs, and it's something we can do in the short to medium term. And current developments in the digitalisation of road freight management and also changes in business practice, I think, are helping us do that. Unfortunately, however, if one looks at the macro level trends, in recent past, they are not encouraging. So if we look at empty running of trucks in Europe, that percentage has dropped very slightly over the past decade, despite the fact that we've seen significant digitalisation of freight over that period. And then the fourth lever is improving the energy efficiency of trucking. As again, I'm sure many of you know, the EU now has fuel economy standards in place for new trucks, which will require a 15% improvement in energy and carbon efficiency by 2025 and a 30% improvement by 2030. And those standards are being reviewed next year and may well be intensified. Also draw attention to a study that was done by TNO, published last year, suggesting there was a potential to improve truck energy efficiency by between 28 and 33% by 2030. And then the final lever, reducing the carbon content of the energy that we use in the road freight sector. This is the only one that's going to get us ultimately to zero emissions. Still significant disagreement and uncertainty as to which of the main renewable energy options will dominate. Although I think the movement, as we will see in just a moment, is more towards use of batteries rather than hydrogen. But important point to note, this is a longer term development, and we will need to pull those other four levers pretty powerfully, it seems to me, to cut the future demand for energy in the road freight sector, and that will reduce the amount of energy we then have to defossilise with a shift to renewables. While waiting for the new generation of low carbon trucks to take to the roads, we need to be more heavily promoting what I call the MBO measures, the managerial, behavioural, operational measures. Now this is challenging in the road freight sector because of its very high fragmentation. So in Europe we've got over 500,000 small and medium-sized carriers. My university in collaboration with Transporion and the Smart Freight Centre has been surveying large samples of these small carriers in recent years to assess their attitudes to decarbonisation. I've just extracted a couple of graphs from our reports. First asked them to what extent these small road carriers see a business opportunity in decarbonisation. Sadly, still around 40% of them see little financial benefit in doing that, though if you compare the data for 2020 with that of 2022, you can see the trend is moving in the right direction. An increasing proportion are seeing business benefit in decarbonisation. We also asked them what incentives they would like to see to encourage them to decarbonise, and if I just flag up the four at the top of that list, top of the list was getting customers to pay a bit more for a lower carbon transport service. Also role for government, first of all to provide incentives for the switch to low carbon vehicles, and also government subsidies for the retrofitting of emission reducing devices on trucks, and also getting customers perhaps to offer longer contracts for lower carbon transport, so that companies would then have a longer period in which to recoup the higher cost of low carbon vehicles. And this relates to an important new initiative being run by the Smart Freight Centre called the Sustainable Freight Buyers Alliance, which aims to use procurement more effectively as a decarbonisation lever, because the vast majority of road freight operations are outsourced. Even big logistics providers subcontract most of their road freight. And so these companies, the shippers and the large logistics providers, now have an incentive to get their carriers to decarbonise their operations, particularly because those emissions fall within the Scope 3 category. And big shippers, for example, which will have to be reporting on their emissions and how they're going to reduce them here in the UK as part of what's called the Corporate Sustainable Reporting Initiative, which will be phased in over the next few years. And also science-based targeting, again, requires those companies that are aiming to become net zero, again, to report and reduce their emissions at a supply chain level. So there's, I think, a growing need really for these companies to encourage, advise, incentivize their carriers to decarbonize their operations. And the price mechanism is also going to be applied here in Europe. In July this year, the European Parliament approved an extension of the European Emissions Trading Scheme into transport and buildings. This will be phased in from 2024. It's going to be called ETS2, and it will apply to commercial vehicles, to road freight vehicles for the first time. It's felt this is needed to help to close the gap in the total cost of ownership between the new low carbon vehicles and the current generation of diesel vehicles, and will be necessary, it's reckoned, to reach the Fit for 45 emission targets. Questions often asked is, what will be the carbon price within this new ETS2 system for transport? We don't know as yet, but I noticed, you can see the date there in November, that in ETS1, the existing emission trading scheme, a tonne of CO2 was valued at about 75 euros a tonne. Now, given the very slim profit margins within the road freight sector, if a similar figure were applied to the new ETS2 system, I think that would exert a significant influence really on the future decarbonisation behaviour of trucking companies. And it's not just a matter of pricing. Regulation, I think, will also promote this transition to what I'm calling fossil-free trucking. At the COP26 conference last year in Glasgow, 15 countries and many businesses committed to making all new trucks zero emission by 2035 in the case of the lighter ones, 2040 in the case of the heavier ones, and a further 12 countries signed that memorandum of understanding at the COP27 conference recently, and that includes the United States. But nevertheless, the move from a diesel fleet to a low carbon fleet is going to take time. If one just looks at the figures for the EU, in 2019 there were 6.1 million medium and heavy duty trucks, and about 361,000 new ones were bought in that year. So you divide one number into the other, and it would suggest that transformation of the fleet could take as much as 17 years. So it's going to be a slow process. If one looks at what the barriers will be to this happening, there was a survey done by McKinsey and the World Economic Forum of a broad group of stakeholders, asking them what they thought the main barriers would be to the adoption of low carbon vehicles. And it's worth noting that they didn't feel that the main barriers would be total cost of ownership reduction or the supply of these vehicles. They emphasized the importance of the financing and building out of a new infrastructure, really, to accommodate the new generation of mainly battery powered vehicles. Just on total cost of ownership, draw attention to a recently published study by TNO, the Dutch Research Institute, suggesting that even by 2030, we will see the total operating cost of battery-powered vehicles achieving parity or below parity over most distance ranges for trucks. And also in the case of hydrogen, worth noting that even by 2040, it's unlikely that hydrogen fuel cell vehicles will achieve that parity with diesel vehicles. And also just refer to some recent work done by the German ministry, a graph that they published recently showing how they think the demand for new trucks in Germany will change up to 2030, seeing obviously fossil fuel vehicles drop quite dramatically to be replaced mainly by battery powered vehicles, with hydrogen fuel cell vehicles playing, I think, a limited niche role really in the future German truck market. The electrification of the road fleet to achieve this degree of decarbonisation will require five things, it seems to me. First of all, we need a continuation of the decarbonisation of the EU electricity supply. Unfortunately, the trend has kicked up recently as a result of the energy crisis caused by the Ukrainian invasion. But hopefully we'll get back onto that downward track again. We can also exploit micro-generation opportunities by covering the roofs of distribution centres in Europe with solar panels, for example, and using wind turbines. We'll clearly have to have a major effort to roll out networks of fast chargers across Europe, as ACEA, the European Truck Manufacturing Association, has shown. We'll need to ensure adequate and reliable supply of battery materials, ramping up the mining and the processing, and recognizing the geopolitics of all of this. You know, as I'm sure many of you are aware, we're very heavily dependent on some politically unstable countries, particularly DRC, for cobalt, and China controls currently about 80% of EV battery production, but also further upstream, 80% of cobalt processing is based in China. Seems to me we're going to have to intensify the use of scarce battery materials in the road fleet. I mean, I drive an electric car, and unfortunately it sits in my driveway 95% of the time. I would prefer to see the use of these materials prioritised for commercial vehicles that are used much more intensively than private cars. And we have to supplement the static charging of trucks with dynamic charging using electric road systems. This will then allow us, as I say here, to downscale the size and weight of the batteries. It will reduce the need for static charging capacity. And it seems to me that of the various ways in which we can electrify highways, catenary is the one that is the most mature technology with the most trials. So I would like to see that progress really for trucks in the near future. Finally, returning to the sequestration side of net zero, what are the prospects of there being a widespread retrofitting of diesel trucks with carbon capture and storage, while we're waiting for the switch to vehicles powered by renewable energy? There have been several academic papers published on this subject in recent years, most of them fairly positive about this technology. There's been significant research done in this subject, by companies, foremost among them, I think, Aramco, the world's most wealthy oil company by market capitalization. They reckon that if every heavy-duty truck in the world was equipped with carbon capture technology, then you could save 708 million tons of CO2 per annum. And to put that into perspective, that's about twice as much CO2 as the UK emitted in total in 2021. But we have to be careful here. This company clearly has a vested interest in maintaining demand for diesel fuel in the transport sector, and also slowing the move to renewable energy. And the other worry is that the CO2 captured might be used by Aramco for what they call enhanced oil recovery. I mean, squeezing more oil out of existing wells. There are other companies involved in applying this technology. There's Remora, for example, very open about their results of their research. They reckon that the carbon capture and storage equipment and the tanks for the captured CO2 would weigh about 2.3 tons. They reckon that you could capture about half a ton of CO2 in the course of a journey. They claim in the case of US trucks there would be no loss of cubic capacity because you would use the equipment really to fill the gap between the tractor and the trailer. In the US, of course, there's I think no limit on the length of a vehicle. There is in Europe, and so Craptus, which is a European company looking at this technology, I think envisage the equipment going above the cab. The Remora argue that they would be using heat from the truck exhaust to power the carbon capture and storage process, and therefore there would be no additional fuel burn. They reckon you could capture between 80 and 90% of the CO2 coming out of the exhaust of the vehicle. And they are committed not to use that captured CO2 for enhanced oil recovery. But this is still a very early development of this technology, and it's debatable how quickly it could be scaled up and applied in the real world. But if we don't capture the CO2 before it's released by the truck exhaust, then in the future we would need to filter 1,600 tons of air to recapture 1 ton of CO2 from the road freight sector, and in the process use vast amounts of zero carbon electricity using machines such as this. This in the future would represent an enormous challenge for mankind, and it's for that reason that many climate scientists are now very suspicious of the whole concept of net zero. They see it as a dangerous trap, as expressed by these 3 very distinguished climate scientists who said within a few decades we will need to transform our civilization from one that currently pumps out 40 billion tons of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere each year to one that produces a net removal of tens of billions. Net zero has licensed a recklessly cavalier burn now, pay later approach, which has seen carbon emissions continue to soar. So my final message is, let's hope the road freight sector doesn't fall into this trap, and that it does everything it can to mitigate emissions in the near future, and tries to minimize the amount of subsequent sequestration that will be required. I hope you found that presentation of interest. Those are my contact details, and enjoy the rest of the workshop. Thank you very much.